Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Today we're going to talk about the difference between server components and client components in Next.js. So let's get started. First of all, we're going to talk about how the Next.js application differentiates between the server components and the client components. By default, all components are server components, but if we want to make it explicit, we can say on the top of the file, use server, and that makes it a server component. And if we wanted to make it a client component, we use client directive, this very specific string we added on the top of the component file. And components are just like in React, in normal React, all components are functions, and these functions return some JSX, okay? And this JSX is rendered into HTML. That's the first thing. And the second thing we need to talk about the difference between a server component and a client component is when to use each one of them. For client components, we use client components like in this one. If I go here, I use client components when you need to use hooks, like in use state, use effect, something like that, or when we have event handlers, like in this one. Okay, because in server components you cannot use hooks and you cannot use event handlers. Okay, like in this component, this is a server. Okay, here there is no reference to any hook or to any event handler. And the third thing we talk about is that in client components, like in this one, we cannot, for example, import, let's say here we cannot import server component. Okay, supposing that we have some server component defined in our code base, I cannot import it directly to a client component and render it. That will cause an error. And if you want to work around that, you can go to the documentation, and here they tell you how to use how to render server component inside the client component. Basically, you pass it as a prop. Now, you need to understand that this concept cannot be grasped fully unless you have some project you're working on and you have a context around this topic and around this idea of passing server components as prop to a client component. So just keep in mind that you cannot render the server component directly without passing it as a prop. Now, the fourth and the most important one is data fetching. In data fetching, I want to go to the documentation to show you something. If I go here, in data fetching, you can see that this is a server component, fetching data on the server. In a server component, in Next.js, introducing the server components, we can use async await syntax directly inside the component. Okay, so this is a component, a server component, and we can use the async await directly inside this component. So we don't need to use a combination of use effect and use state like we used to do in React to fetch data when the component is rendered on the browser. Now we can do it directly inside the server component. Okay, and it brings the data directly from the server. And it's gonna be too fast because the rendering happens on the server and fetching the data happens also on the server. So the data fetching process is gonna be too fast. Okay. And if we want to fetch data inside the client component, we can achieve that in multiple ways. And the documentation is very thorough about that, but we can achieve that using use effect with use state like we used to do in traditional React applications. But now I want to show you a very important diagram that I want you to understand to fully grasp the concept of server components with client components, and that concept is this. Here in front of me, you can see I have a Next.js application loaded inside the browser, and that Next.js application makes its first and initial request when it first loaded on the browser. It makes its first request to the server, which is the Next server, either localhost or on Vercel. And that server let's suppose that the request is requesting a server component, and inside that server component we have a client component. Okay, so in the initial request, what happens is that the next server renders both the server component and the client components. What do I mean by rendering a component? Rendering a component means converting the JSX that we wrote inside the components into HTML, okay? And that HTML, you can see here, is extracted from these components, and as a response, we get the HTML. The initial response is mainly HTML, and it has some reference to JavaScript through the script files. Okay, and that script file has a reference to some JavaScript inside the server. So since we have JavaScript like use effect, use state, use form, or probably event handlers or something like that, since we have all this JavaScript is not loaded the first time the application makes a request to the server. When it is loaded, that's the point I want you to understand. The point is, on the initial request, we mainly have HTML, and since it has a reference to some JavaScript on the server, it makes a second request, okay, like in this case, it makes a second request 2 to the server, and that request, the purpose of that request is to extract the JavaScript from the client components, all the client components. We extract the JavaScript from these components and we send them back as a response to the browser. And when we send them back, they are loaded on the browser and they are executed on the browser. So use effect is executed as soon as the initial response is made to the browser, and same things with event handlers and use states and all of that. So you can see that from this pattern. If I go back, you can see that from this pattern, I have the HTML first loaded on the screen without any heavy JavaScript, because we basically in these applications we write mainly JavaScript. So that's where the heavy lifting is on the JavaScript. But in the initial response that we get from the server, we have only HTML, and that's what makes Next.js very great for SEO and user experience, because our users can see something at least on the screen, even if they can't interact using states or using event handlers. They cannot interact with the application on first load, but at least they see something. They see the HTML and the CSS. And in the second request, which happens in the background, we get the JavaScript, and that makes our application interactive. And to prove my point, I want to show you something. If I go back to my application, okay, I have this application, which is the same application I run on inside this VS Code. And if I go here in this application, okay, let's make another request. Okay, let's examine the request that I got from the server. I have this local host. Okay, I have this local host, and if I go to the preview I can see at least it's the same: choose file, no file chosen, etc. So I can see the content, and that is expected, of course, to see the content. But the fact that I can see the content inside this response, okay, on the network tab, the fact that I can see the response here proves that the client component is initially rendered on the server, as I told you about already, like in here. Okay, the first time the client component is rendered on the server. And that's why, okay, it's rendered on the server and it returns HTML, and that's why I can see the response here inside the network tab. There is no JavaScript here. There is, if you look at the response, there is no JavaScript, only script tags. You can see that only script tags, and these script tags make another request to the server to bring back the JavaScript. Okay, like in this case. I make another request to bring the JavaScript, and that JavaScript is loaded back in the browser and executed there. So that's all I have to say about data fetching and rendering components in the server for both server components and client components. One thing I forgot to mention about when to use server components and client components, I told that client components should be used when we have hooks and we have event handlers. But when it comes to server components should be used as much as possible, and that is the recommended approach by the Next.js documentations, because it causes improvement in user experience and the performance of our application. And also that's the intended way of using Next.js, because Next.js is meant to be used with content-driven applications that don't have that much interactivity, like in Airbnb, for example. If you go to that application, it's very interactive. Next.js applications are meant to be less interactive through content-driven applications, but still you can use that using a combination of server components and client components. And also I want to show you something that is very relevant to us, which is I told you that here in data fetching, if I go to data fetching part, in data fetching I can use async await syntax inside the server component. And in this case, I told you that there is no need anymore to use useState, a combination of useState with useEffect to fetch data from a server. And another thing is that we don't need to use state management libraries like Redux, for example. We can use it, but not too much. And I have a very important and very interesting blog that I want you to read. I will link to that in the description box below. So it talks about ZooStand, which is the same with Redux, for example. I want you to go through this because it's very important to understand Redux in Next.js applications can cause security bugs and security issues. For example, when you have state that is managed on the server. By the way, this blog discusses that there is nothing called state in server components, because server components are meant to be stateless. So anyway, if we store any state inside the server for our application, that state will be shared by all the users. So if suppose we have an authentication system and each user has his own state, and that state is stored on the server, that state is gonna be shared by all the users. Okay, you can read this, and there is a link to this video as well. I will link to this video as well on the description box. It's very, very interesting video. And also this blog, make sure to check out all the links in here and read the thread, because it's something really important, and I don't want you to create applications that cause any security bugs in the future. So that's it, all I have to say about server components and client components. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please click the like button below and subscribe to my channel to see more useful content like this in the future. And until then, see you very soon.